Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jamie Mathias, Executive Director of the Texas Latino School Boards Association, one of 3 Latino school boards associations in the United States dedicated to providing research and resources to school board members, superintendents, and educators who are committed to closing opportunity and achievement gaps for the 2.9 million Latino students in our Texas public schools. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with George Scott, a former trustee of the Katy ISD and the author of the new work, The Lies of Texas. We'll look forward next week to exploring this book, The Lies of Texas, which is available on Amazon and also through our TLSBA website. This week, we have the joy of unpacking how the Texas education miracle has failed Texas students. Before we get started, we just want to acknowledge up front that what we're doing here is tackling a problem that has been created by the Texas Education Agency. This has nothing to do with districts or district leadership. So we do find the challenge of having to tell the truth about school districts in a way that does not blame or villainize school districts. School districts, we recognize, are the real victims here, school districts and students. Having said that, Mr. Scott, we'll kick it off to you to help us to lay some foundation for a conversation today on how it is that the Texas education miracle has failed college-going students.
You know, it's a great point, and the way you expressed it is just superior, literally. And there's something important. We're going to be talking about college graduation rates today, by ethnicity, by college entrance scores. And there's just a lot of educational, industrial, complex smoke and mirrors that tries to disguise the bottom line to college readiness. The key thing that you've made by saying the Texas educational miracle failed is to link what happens in public education with what happens in higher education. It's a dream world to say that the Texas Education Agency is solely and completely responsible for what happens in K through 12, and the Texas Higher Education Board is responsible for what happens post high school. That's just nonsense. But there are many that want you to believe that. There are many within the educational establishment that would like to see this divided highway. What we're going to do today, and what we're going to look at today, is a group of graduates from the 2009-10 graduating classes of the entire state of Texas. Okay. And it is a public information request that I put in several years ago, got multiple years. I have since updated that request, and we're eventually going to start looking through 2012-13. But let's focus on 2009-10 today. I want to make a couple of very significant points in talking about the Texas Education Agency. The 2009-10 graduates of Texas high schools are children of TAS and children of tax. They are at the finish line that proclaimed a miracle as they were matriculating through school. So this is not reaching back in time just for the sake of a search mission to find a bad year. This is where the heart and soul of accountability in looking beyond Texas public education really begins. So we're going to be looking at those graduation rates and those ethnicity rates. But in context of the premise that you have set, by talking about the miracle failing kids, I would like to share a screen, and we're going to spend maybe 10 minutes. Dr. Mathias, remember, I've given you carte blanche to interrupt.
Awesome.
When I'm boring you, ask a question, because if I'm boring you, I'm boring someone else. But let me share a screen here. And
while you're doing that, Mr. Scott, we just want to remind all of those who are in with us today that this Texas education miracle is something. So we're looking at the height of the Texas education miracle today, but this is something that began, what, at least 10 to 15 years
1990. TAS, it began with TAS, and people think, why are we going exploring for dinosaurs? TAS was a dinosaur. No, it wasn't. It started the Texas Educational Miracle. It started constitutional testing. And I would remind people that think that the foundation is not important. I have this great video that I like to show, won't show it today. Yeah, you can Google it on YouTube and you can find Corpus Christi high-rise implosion. And you watch the building come down. We've all seen the videos of implosions. It's because the foundation was bad most of the time. Sometimes they're old, but when you're building a new building that hasn't even been occupied and you're imploding it, the foundation was bad. The foundation of the Texas Educational Miracle will always be relevant 30 years later. Here's what we've got, though. We're going to be talking about college entrance scores. This is not the same year. This is for 18-19. This is the most recent non-COVID year. And what we're looking at is students that took the English 1 and the English 2 end of course test in 2018-19. And last week we talked about approach being below grade level. The state of Texas has a fail, an approach, a meets, and a masters. The state of Texas needs to have that approach, approaching grade level. But the red here shows you it's bad. It's not good. It's not good for the children. It's not good for their academic futures. It's below grade level. But it gets to count as a gold star for the state because they have, quote, met their self-proclaimed burden to close the academic achievement gap for all kids. Here we're just showing state to put Hispanics, African Americans, at-risk, retesters, and not retesters in context. So as we look at the college data that we're going to get to fairly soon, consider this. There were 170,905 students in the state of Texas who took the English 1 test. I'm sorry, y'all are just going to have to forgive me. I don't know. I apologize for that. There we go. Just forgive me my non-techie. There were 494,637 student documents. 467,000 were tested in English 1 and 170,000 failed. 65,827 approached but were below grade level. 175,000 met and 55,900 mastered. Now that's how this system was created. Give me one more second to correct what I did wrong a while ago, and we'll be back and running. There we go. All right, so what we see here is this. Cutting through all the numbers, I'm not asking you or anyone to memorize these numbers. They'll be available to you. Of the students that took the English 1 test for the first time in the 9th grade mostly in the state of Texas in 18-19, 40% were below grade level. 58% of the Hispanics were below grade level. 64% of the African Americans were below grade level. 74% of the at-risk children were below grade level, and 94% of the retesters were below grade level.
Mr. Scott, could you pause and tell us what a retester is so we can know?
A retester is I took the end of course English test last year, or I've taken it twice, and by gosh, I'm going to pass it. I'm going to take it a 3rd time. I'm going to take it a 4th time. But we're talking about students who have previously failed. This brings the point. You and I are going to, when we, in this seminar series or webinar series, we're going to get to our great public information request about the leavers, the dropouts. We won't deal with that today. But these 73,770 kids who are retaking the English 1 test are where the dropouts begin. This is the 9th grade. This is a freshman class, and this is where it begins. Now we look at English 2. There are fewer students who take English 2 because some of the kids have already dropped out. The enrollment is down. 74% of the at-risk kids who took the English test were below grade level. Now, more passed it because they were at the equity standard. Approach counts for passing the test. But look at this, 57% who were taking the English 2 test in Hispanics were below grade level. 74% of the at-risk were below grade level. 94% of the retesters were at grade level. And even as sad, 40% of the students taking the end of, this is the combined classes. When you add English 1 and English 2, these numbers I'm going for are the students how they scored on English 1, how the different students scored on English 2, and I've lumped them into one table. So when you look at the freshman and sophomore class, basically, not 100%, but those taking the 9th and 10th grade English 1, English 2 test, 40% of the students taking that test who are taking it for the first time were below grade level. Look at the ones when you combine it, this is accumulated human tragedy. At risk, 74%, 62% for African Americans who are taking it, English 1 or English 2. So what we're talking about here, Jamie, is this. When you see the number of students who are Hispanic or even in the state who enroll in a community college or university and they have no SAT score or no ACT score, and you're seeing that 70% or more, we'll see the numbers in a minute. When you see these dramatic dropout rates, it didn't just start when they got their diploma. It started at the advent of the Texas educational miracle. And I will tell you this, I've dealt with attorneys of various stripes. They're all good people, but it's my firm conviction that the main civil rights attorneys in the state of Texas have failed to look at this kind of data significantly and effectively. And so we can go now to the college data, but let's keep one thing as you share your screen and we shift to that data. Let's keep this in mind. These tables that we're looking at, in which y'all done this magnificent report, does not claim to be 100% of every student that enrolled in a college or a university in the state of Texas from that graduating class. Some students go out of college. Some students may take 2 years off, go explore the Himalayas or the Rocky Mountains and come back and score. So it's not a 100%, but I tell you what it isn't. It is not a Florida exit poll, okay? It is a major apples to apples report that the Higher Education Coordinating Board does to say, how did students who graduated in the spring of a year and enrolled in a Texas community college or university, how did they do in the industry standard 6 years of getting a college degree? And while it is not 100% of every student, if you look at other reports which give you insight, which we will do, not in this one, which we will do, you see that the bottom line does not change. So the numbers we're going to be looking at here are significant.
Tremendous. And to be clear, Mr. Scott, what I'm understanding now is that the data that we're seeing here comes to us from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, and it's data that we've obtained then through a public information request on college success.
That is correct. And in fact, I'll take it to another step. I don't always do this. Rarely, in fact, do I do this. But I actually sent my raw data tables that you've seen and your team have seen. I actually sent those to an extremely high level top leader, not the top leader, but a very high level leader in the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to let them look at how I was presenting the data. They made a couple of suggestions out of a superabundance of caution for FERPA, which I willingly and totally did. Okay.
Okay. So, Mr. Scott, help us to adjust our eyes and see, try to wrap our minds around the information that we're seeing here. I see on the left-hand side that we see SAT scores and ACT scores, but then at the top, that first row at the top, no SAT or ACT has some significant numbers that dwarf the numbers below. Help us to understand what we're seeing in this table. This table is dramatic. The data that we got from the Higher Education Coordinating Board for 2009-10 included 148,919 students who enrolled in a community college or a university in the fall after their high school graduation. And this was one of my better PIRs. It took quite some time to work out all the details, but I wanted to know on a student by student basis, meaning imagine an Excel spreadsheet, 148,919 rows. That's what I got. Sure. And for each student, it said, did they take an SAT? Did they take a ACT? And then it not only had that, to comply with FERPA, and there's so many students here, it was not super hard, but we did ranges. 800 to 890, 900 to 990, 1,000 to 1,090. So we disaggregated the data as available tables coming down the road will show. And so we were able to identify out of that 148,919, 73,390, the College Board did not have a record of either an SAT or an ACT. So to be clear, these are students who are in post-secondary studies now, who are in a 2-year college, a community college, or even a 4-year college without having taken the SAT or the ACT, correct? Well, I think you'll find that most of those would be a community college. There's some technical issues why you may have gone into a university and didn't have to show an SAT or ACT, but community colleges are open enrollment. You don't, at least at this time, I'm not familiar with today's standards, but I don't think it's changed. Students did not have to show an SAT or an ACT to get general admission to a community college. Now, some community colleges, I believe, had some special programs where they looked at SATs or ACTs. So you're primarily thinking here, the big number is that would include students who went to a community college. Okay. And of those who had no SAT or ACT, 9,422 did earn an associate degree. 3,291 earned an associate and a bachelor's degree, and 8,616 earned a bachelor degree. So if you want to find out how many total degrees were, you have to add associate degrees plus bachelor degrees, and then subtract that middle number, which they got both. Okay. One kid got both degrees. So to find out how many had no degrees, 52,061 had no degree. So these are the bottom line numbers. And as the noted psychometrician Gomer Pyle, who worked for Andy Griffith on one of my favorite TV shows, Andy Griffith show in my childhood, made a conclusion. He said, Shazam, Andy, Shazam. The higher your college entrance score, it appears to be some correlation between whether or not you get a degree or not. That does not mean that everyone with a high degree, high SAT score, college entrance gets a degree, nor does it mean that everyone with no or low does not get a degree. But of the 148,919 students who graduated in 2009-10, this is what happened. Now,
when you look at ethnicity, this whole report that you did, and I helped you put the numbers, but y'all are the one that prepared the report, is what it shows is something very, very dramatic. And you and I have talked about this many times, Dr. Mathias. High-level academic performance doesn't have anything negative to do with children of color, minority kids, ethnicity, whatever nomenclature you want to use. What these tables show is that children of every ethnicity are blowing off the tops of the college entrance scores. They're blowing off the tops of college performance. They're getting their degrees. What it also shows is the significant high-level percentage of students who the state of Texas have said meets the equity gap. They have passed the test. Well done, thy good and faithful servant, but can't get through a community college or university to get that degree. And I think when you debate public educators, as I have, you always have to do asterisks. We know that there are many reasons that students drop out of college, period. Smart kids, personal reasons. But when you're looking at 148,919, the state of Texas and the Texas Education Agency has to stop pretending that the outliers are important. This is the real world. And so what you see is that as the SAT scores rise and as the ACT scores rise, the number and percent with no degrees drops. I am not asserting a statistical correlation per se. I didn't get a statistician to look at that, but you don't have to be a statistician to have common sense. And the common sense of this is that the state of Texas, pretending that it has met the constitutional equity gap for children, disadvantaged children, statistically dominated by children of color, the Texas Education Agency pretending that it has closed the achievement gap for these children, meeting its constitutional burden, falls apart the brighter the light you shine on data that people don't normally look at.
So, Mr. Scott, before we look at the visualization of these data, I just want to focus on three numbers in particular. So on the very right-hand column where it says the percent no degree, what I'm understanding is that of the 73,390 students who enrolled not having taken the SAT or ACT, roughly 71% of them left college with debt, presumably, but with no degree.
They left with no degree. We can say that.
There you go. Because
of the state. What should be done, I wish the U.S. Justice Department, it's not going to happen under Texas rule, but I wish the U.S. Justice Department, I wish the U.S. Department of Education would launch an investigation that quantifies the college debt by students who dropped out of college. I would like to see that number. It is way beyond my ability to do that, not talent-wise. I would know how to structure such a research, but the cost and the FERPA and the privacy issues would make that just virtually impossible for an individual who is independent, like you and I are, and like the leadership of your group is, to be able to afford to do that. One of the best things that could happen is for the Wall Street Journal. They've got great columnists with that newspaper, or the New York Times, or a national group, or the United States Department of Justice, or the United States Department of Education. Investigate the significant point you just raised. How many of these kids who got no degree are stuck with college debt that was reasonably safe to project as possible? And when you look at it year after year after year, you could develop a statistical analytical package that would do that. That's beyond that's beyond your group. It's beyond my resources, but someone should hold the state of Texas and perhaps other states responsible for this.
Before we go on to the bar charts, the other two
maybe even attorneys who are fighting that debt should find a courtroom that would be willing that the state of Texas to explore the issue if the state of Texas and member colleges accepted students with some knowledge that they would likely fail but still have debt. I'm not making that as an allegation, but I am absolutely raising a profound question that deserves empirical analysis.
It certainly causes one to stop and think of the persons who might financially benefit from so many students enrolling in college, but dropping out with so much debt. The other two numbers I want to point out then is if 70.9% were not bad enough, the two numbers on here that are higher than that is that we see that those who score at the lowest level on the SAT or the ACT, that is with lower than a 700 on the SAT or lower than a 13 on the ACT, are leaving college at a rate of 75.3 to 83.7%. That is more than 4 out of every 5 students who go to college with an ACT score of less than 13 drops out.
Well, that's what the numbers show. And it is beyond our ability at this point in time to create the causation or the correlation, but in terms of that with college debt. I just think it is a massive issue that someone should be held accountable for. And, you know, I've kind of given up on civil rights attorneys in the state of Texas. I've kind of given up on a certain group of attorneys in the state of Texas. Maybe a private attorney suing on behalf of individual students saddled with debt who would look at this data or listen to this discussion. Maybe they ought to try to do it as a private lawsuit. I guarantee you, I would be disqualified on a jury. Okay, I couldn't get on that jury.
Yeah. So, Mr. Scott, we have here college success of graduates from our Texas high schools in 2010. It's important for our friends to understand that we also have data for 2011, 2012, 2013, other years leading up to the pandemic, but this is as representative of the data as anything that we're going to see. We could just as easily have put these bar charts, we could have flipped them so that there was what we refer to as an upward sloping bar chart, or there would be a positive relationship between the SAT score and the number of students who received degrees. Instead, we flipped this chart upside down to focus on the black bars, which in this case is the percent of students at each level of the SAT who did not earn degrees. What we see, of course, goes back to the data that we saw up above. That is, namely, the higher the score that you get on the SAT, the more likely you are to walk away with a degree, or conversely, as this chart shows, the lower your score is, the more likely you are to leave college with debt and no degree.
All right, let me protect us here, because what you said is 100% correct. What I've said is correct. But there may be people out there who say, well, Dr. Mathias, who has a PhD, and George Scott, who doesn't, okay, are asserting that there is this certitude, definable, absolute correlation between SAT, ACT, and graduation. We're not asserting that at all. But I tell you what, Picasso didn't paint that picture, okay? This is not modern art. It's okay to have, in effect, a de facto photograph that talks about the trends and the real world without having to have a firm, certifiable statistical correlation. I think that a statistical correlation could be created, but the fact of the matter is, the picture you've just painted is the picture that reflects reality.
Any additional comments on what you see when you look at this bar chart, Mr. Scott?
I see, oh, that's such a personal question. I could take that question really anywhere. Dr. Matthias, in my career, and I'm a conservative, it's getting harder and harder to vote for Republicans. And I know this is not a political show, but I'm just putting myself in context personally. I've been a conservative all my life on economic issues. I do remember when conservatives believed in due process, due diligence, civil rights, and other issues, but I am basically a philosophical conservative. And in my career, I have gone everywhere from the most leading liberal organization, I think, in the United States, the Southern Poverty Law Center, back in about 2000, asking them to intervene on this. And as recently as 6 months or so, some Texas folks. When I see this chart, I see wasted effort by the legal representation of these kids. These kids deserve better attorneys. These children deserve their day in court. These children are not being served by the system that proclaims, that has proclaimed and proclaims a miracle, or we're doing so great, we're doing so great, we're being successful. We have high passing rates. An attorney should internalize this. The state of Texas defines its constitutional equity burden, including students who are below its own de minimis standards of grade level. That's what I think when I see that table.
Sure.
And you've got many more good ones in the report.
We do. As I'm scanning to the next one, I just want to say, I take this personally only because for me, these bar charts look like they're just numbers. But for me, there are human faces behind every single number here. And so to think of all the human faces that are behind, that are going to college and are leaving with debt and no degrees is just something that is.
It's infuriating.
It's
infuriating.
Yeah. Here we
so
see.
There you see the same. Right now, we may, if we keep on the numbers, we might be pretending that we're asking people to memorize it during a webinar, but the data is available. I mean, your group has done a fantastic job. The first time in my entire life I ever watched myself on YouTube, I was blown away, man. We're committed to making this available. We'll find the best way to do it. What we're doing in the first 3 weeks here is trying to set the framework for hopefully what will come if there are people in the state, if there are people in Texas, or there's media outlets throughout the United States who want to pick up the phone and call you and say, we're kind of interested, could we do more? What I'm hoping for here, I've battled this 25, 30 years. I've fired every bullet in my gun except this one. And what we have to have come forward is someone that shares our passion, Dr. Matthias, someone that lives in the real world. And these are not statistics. These are people, these are kids.
There you go. In this bar chart, then, what we're seeing now is, whereas up above, we saw the SAT scores. Now we're trying to visualize the ACT scores. We notice a similar negative.
And there's a correlation between the SAT and the ACT. I think they call that a concordance. So what you're seeing is the highest levels of the ACT just going down the scale, just like we did for the SAT.
Okay. Now we start to break them apart when we look at, for instance, the SAT scores and start to show the types of degrees earned by students. The white part of each bar represents a bachelor degree. The dark gray of each bar is both an associate and a bachelor degree. The lighter gray is an associate degree. And again, the black is leaving college with no degree. Anything that strikes you, Mr. George? Excuse me, Mr.
Same.
Scott, as we look at this?
Same story, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth verse.
Okay.
This is the picture. This is the photograph. This is the story.
We'll see the same, I'm sure, for ACT scores.
Right.
Now we start looking, for instance, here at the Texas Latino School Boards Association, we're particularly interested in the success of our Latinx students, our Latino or Hispanic students, as we've called them in the US Census for some time, how it is that they've been doing. So we start taking a look at the number. This is before we were looking at all students in the state of Texas. Now we're looking only at Latino students or Hispanic students, if you will.
See, it's the key is to get this kind of data, you have to have an understanding of FERPA. And I want to say something here. I would be really derelict. I'm not going to mention the person's name. That person will know if they ever comes across this. I have never in my entire career, second place might be close, but I have never had the cooperation as I did from the Texas Higher Education Board and a couple of people in that organization. This would not exist. This data, they could have thrown up so many roadblocks. Okay, they could have made it so expensive to get this data. But I have to say, and I've been derelict that I didn't say it before. I want to thank the Higher Education Coordinating Board. It goes back several years, 6, 7 years. And then more recently, I was updating it with those additional years, 11, 12, 10, 11, 11, 12, 12, 13, that will eventually process if we can, if we can raise a few bucks to pay the statistician and the people to cut the numbers. But the Higher Ed Board made this data available.
Mr. Scott, what strikes me here is now we're looking, if we look down the second last column, which is Hispanic no degree, we follow that all the way to the bottom. What I'm seeing is that 36,310 Latino students departed from their post-secondary studies. These are the graduates of 1 year of Texas high school graduates. These are the Texas high school graduates of 2010. 36,000 Latino students of which departed their post-secondary studies with no degree. Are we reading this correctly?
I'll put this up. Okay, that's the key. Oh gosh, see, every time I do something like this, I mess up, How do you take the screen down? There, okay. I look back at my original tables as those numbers. They're so scary, I had to look at them again. Okay, yes, they're right, they're okay.
So the following chart that we see then, we have various notes. And again, this report can be found under the research tab of our TLSBA website. So that's tlsba.org/research. You'll find this entire report and be able to print it off yourselves. Here we see the first chart then, which is simply looking at the degrees earned by Latinx students, by Hispanic students, if you will. We see a chart that very much resembles what we saw before, but with slightly higher percentages. We see the same with ACT scores. So a person could dig into this report online. We break it down by degree type for Hispanic students, Latinx students who took the SAT and or the ACT. And then after that, Mr. Scott, we have various tables that deal with other classes of students, white students, Asian students, African-American students. Before we go to those three groups, any observations that you would make with respect to Latino students? What we're seeing is obviously data that resembles the data that we previously saw, the bar charts that we previously saw as well.
Well, where do we start this particular webinar? We started this particular webinar talking about English 1 and English 2 tests in 2018-19. Now, this is years ahead. So if anyone believes that it's going to get exponentially better because this is 2009-10, But what we saw in that whole first 10, 12, 13 minutes, however many it was, as we looked at English 1, English 2, we saw the number and percent of African Americans and Latino students who were below grade level. And I guess if there is something in public education that is more offensive in a big picture way, that the state of Texas would assert that it has met its equity, constitutional, diffusion of knowledge, whatever the lawyers want to call it, obligation to at-risk minority kids, that defining that compliance with constitutional equity includes students who are below grade level is monstrous to me. It's incomprehensible that those advocates for at-risk kids, economically disadvantaged kids, would sit silently for so long and fail to do the homework that is needed to give these children their fair day in court. This ends up in a court of law that would take many hundreds of thousands of dollars to pursue. It will end up with the U.S. Department of Education taking a look at it, but then that may be too big because we don't know for sure what the other states are doing. If any state in the union should be under a microscope more than any other state in the union, it is the state of Texas, because the state of Texas proclaimed an educational miracle. And one of the things that your group is doing, my research, about 2/3 of my research is, I don't know if it is yet, I don't know if y'all pulled the trigger on this, but transcripts from the Rand Corporation, transcripts from Dr. Coburn. We will get back to that when we get into the lives of Texas next week. But there's about 44 documents that are going to be available for download soon as the logistics or whatever work out. And they're going to tend to support, they're going to support the thesis of the Lives of Texas.
Mr. Scott, I'm wondering if we might, this is going off script here today, but you and I were speaking about some of the effects of this Texas education miracle. I know that some of our friends of public education here in Texas were recently sharing an old article from U.S. News and World Report. This is from April the 28th, 2021, high school graduation rates by state. And what we see when we look down at this, the first map is less interesting to us, but we're going to go to the bar charts down below, where it speaks of the total number of schools with 100% graduation rates in each state. So how many schools in each state have a 100% graduation rate? In Alabama, we see 18 schools where 100% of the students graduated. So we see all these bars that seem rather short, if you will, until we scroll down to Texas. And of all the bars on this chart, we simply want to bring our folks' attention to the fact that there is one bar on this chart that is just that is 4 to 5 times longer than any other bar. Now, granted, Texas is a large state, but how could we see a difference between 0 schools in Tennessee with a 100% graduation rate and 290 schools in Texas? Are you able, Mr. Scott, to help us to make sense of this?
Sure, why not? Let's start with 290 schools. There are about 1,100 school districts. I don't have the exact account, but it's somewhere in the range of 1,100 school districts. I don't know if they're talking about high schools here or they're talking about school districts.
The high schools.
Well, then let's just say that 290 is inconsequential.
Huh?
Okay, it's not inconsequential to the 290. Okay, but to give this the first duty of a government statistician is to produce data that makes the government look good. Okay, and I don't know who did this. U.S. News World Report. Maybe I should restate that. This is U.S. News and World Report. What I would say, if I were editor of the U.S. News and World Report, that table would not have been produced in that configuration because it says nothing important. Let's take Texas as an example. I have no ideas what schools are used. If they put the number of schools, we could take a look at the schools. But here's this. Does anybody know what an individual graduation committee is?
So what did
An
you tell us?
individual graduation committee in the state of Texas is students who have not met the terms, the strictest terms of graduation. Maybe they failed 2 or 3 end of course tests. Maybe they didn't meet certain qualifications. There's a whole elaborate definition of individual graduation committees. But when a student has finished the 12 years, finished the senior year, but does not has some deficiency, an individual committee can meet. And I have asked if there is an audit process by the state of Texas over this process beyond just the general rules. And I've been advised by people in school districts, there is no audit process. A committee can say, Juan can graduate, Sally can graduate, John can graduate, Bill can graduate, Helen can graduate. And there are certain things that have to be done. But the bottom line is students in Texas can reach the end of the 12 years, be deficient in terms of graduation requirements, and an individual graduation committee can do certain things, maybe give the student last minute remediation, maybe put them in a course, maybe it's intense. There are different things that can be done, but the bottom line is individual committees get to tell a child, you didn't finish in a normal graduation. We're going to meet, we're going to discuss, we may test you, we may do more remediation, but at the end of the line, we're voting by a committee to let you graduate. Until there is analysis of that process in the state of Texas, this chart is virtually meaningless, if not wholly meaningless in terms of Texas.
Mr. Scott, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you did write a book called The Lies of Texas. Is there a way for one to understand this bar chart by U.S. News and World Report in any way that is not an attempt to undergird this Texas education miracle that we are doing so extremely well in education here in Texas?
I didn't write anything about the individual graduation committees. It is something, Dr. Mathias, that I hope there's about 4 or 5 things that I have not been able to do just simply because money and resources.
Sure.
Okay. And I would love to do an individual graduation thing, but the Lies of Texas per se does not address that issue. What the Lies of Texas will do, it's going to define where we are. It starts off by defining where we are as of the last non-COVID STAR test. It's going to show the equity gaps. It's going to show performance like we've shown already. But then we're going to do a historical walkthrough. We're going to go back and we're going to see, and then you're going to have access to transcripts that when a high-level associate commissioner for the Texas Education Agency went out to the National Academy of Sciences in Irvine, California, and just talked about the academic integrity of the TAS test. It's a grade level TAS test. Well, you're going to see excerpts of that, but you're also going to have access to her full transcript. You're going to see an exchange. We write about it. Dallas ISD back in about 1999 did a study, internal study that showed there was an incredible de minimis, minimal correlation between the students on the TAS test and the students who took the Iowa test of basic skills. And the superintendent writes the commissioner of education at that time and says, we just want to know, and you're going to be able to read about that, and you're going to be able to see the full exchange between the TEA and the superintendent. And what it's going to show is that Dallas showed information that students who were at constitutional grade level equity in the state of Texas in 1999 and 2000 were in the 23rd percentile, correlated to the 23rd percentile on the Iowa test of basic skills in math, and the 10th percentile in language reading on the 10th grade exit test. So what we do, you're going to see how the RAND Corporation, which had been an early praiser of the state's Texas educational miracle, you're going to see how Dr. Stephen Klein, who was the lead researcher, education researcher at that time, went before the same National Academy of Science. And one of the great quotes in my career, that I'm not saying they're cheating, but something is wrong. That's from the lead researcher of the RAND Corporation. So you're going to see his full remarks. Back then, you're going to see that it drove the state of Texas crazy. They put a lot of pressure on. The RAND Corporation came back and did a full study in about October of 2000. And it was a statistical reliable, and you're going to see that. And it didn't back away from the fundamental conclusion. You're going to see Dr. Kathleen Coburn in 1994, famously, the Texas Education Agency, through a federal grant, paid Dr. Coburn, a lawyer and a curriculum expert, a curriculum official in Temple ISD, to do an analysis of the math test in 1994. I think it was published in 95. That's from memory, but 94, 95. And what Dr. Coburn showed, that at the 10th grade exit test at the time, not one single question on the TAS exit test at that period of time was at a 10th grade level. They tested 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th grade questions. You're going to see that confirmed out of a group in California, mathematically correct, a statistician. It included Dr. David Stein. What was it? I think it was Stern. I'm sorry. Dr. David Stern, who eventually led a math review for the Fordham Foundation. He worked on a study that I retained before that. And they concluded the same thing. You're going to see a study out of Dr. William Howland, who looked at performance on the tax test out of Katy ISD and did correlation analysis. His conclusion, doing poorly on tax means it translates to doing poorly on anything else. Doing well on tax correlates to pretty much nothing. The Lies of Texas tries to tell a story. It tries to take 3 decades and billions of numbers and reduce it to about 108, 110 pages with some tables and hopefully positive analysis. And I'm hoping, as you and I have discussed, that between our first 3 webinars, the first 3 publications, that we might possibly attract national media or national attention from outside the state of Texas, who will come in and take a look. If I've made mistakes, come correct my mistakes. I try not to make many. I try not to make any, and I hope I made few. But I want somebody to come in and replicate all of our assertions or refute them.
Mr. Scott, with the less than 5 minutes that we have, we want to make sure that we see this chart as well from this study that we did. So what we did, once we saw the number, the percent of students who were leaving college with and without degrees, we started to look at them by breaking them down Here we see for every score range of the SAT here and of the ACT below, we see that the first column will be for Asian students, the second column for white students, the third column for Hispanic or Latinx students, and then the fourth column for African American students. We definitely see various trends here, if you will. What strikes you, Mr. Scott, as we focus our eyes on this chart? What are we seeing?
What it shows me is that I could not do that chart. That's above my skill set. But what it does, it takes all of this data and it puts it side by side by ethnicity. Okay. And if someone can look at a table like that and has the audacity to assert that the state of Texas over the past 30 years has met its constitutional burden to close the achievement gap for economically disadvantaged kids, statistically dominated by children of color, they're not seeing the same picture I'm seeing. And I think it also shows something very, very else important. And I made the point earlier, you've made the point before, is look at those higher level SAT, ACT scores, and you see a lot of Hispanics and African Americans and truthfully economically disadvantaged students blowing the top off the college entrance and getting those degrees. Can I just say this one more time? The high level performance is not a subject of ethnicity. And those that believe it is need to be on a different planet. High level performance is subject to opportunity and taking children where they are and getting them to where they need to be. And without crutches and without pretense and without playing games like approaches. Go back to the first segment where I started with the exchange with Commissioner McMarath. It starts the lies of Texas, and that is the exchange with the commissioner that basically prompted him to acknowledge that constitutional equity in the state of Texas is defined to include children below grade level. And you can bake it, you can broil it, you can microwave it, you can cook it however you want it. The end result of that recipe is a human tragedy. And too many people have become too content with turning a blind eye to the human tragedy that the Texas Education Agency has created over the last 3 decades for too many children of color.
Mr. Scott, we'll give you a chance for the last word in just a moment. Before then, we want to remind all who are joining us for this webinar that we will be back next Tuesday exploring the book, The Lies of Texas by George Scott, available on Amazon, also at our TLSBA website. You can find it at tlsba.org/research. You'll find a digital copy to be able to read through before we meet again next Tuesday. We'll meet next Tuesday, February the 22nd, and then we'll take a 1-week break before launching into a fascinating study of various organizations here in Texas. Mr. Scott, we're going to give you the last word before we take a break for the day and come back next week for the Lies of Texas.
That's a pretty nice smile for a mean dude. I can't wait for the Lies of Texas next week.
Tremendous. Looking forward to it. We want to thank all who have joined us for this. We know that all who are members of TLSBA member districts receive continuing education credits for their participation. We just want to thank all of you for joining us, but thank you more than anything for your advocacy for our Latinx students here in Texas. We're counting on all of us coming together and advocating for their sake. If not us, who? If not now, when? If not for the sake of our children and grandchildren, why? Let's do this. Have a great day, y'all.